I'm Elaine Reyes, and this is a special edition of UN Insider from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil.
Coming up.
Our times are tumultuous, and we need to race much faster to tackle fundamental common challenges.
Leaders from around the globe gather in Brazil for the G20. Will the summit mark concrete steps toward a more sustainable world? The Security Council votes on a ceasefire resolution for Gaza as severe food shortages grip the Palestinian territory.
Financing is growing over the past few years, but the needs of people that are displaced have grown even more.
Meeting the needs of millions forced from their homes and the places that host them. A conversation about surging numbers of displaced people. Next.
And I have come to Rio with a simple message. G20 leaders must lead. And G20 countries, by definition, have tremendous economic clout and they yield massive diplomatic leverage. They must use it to tackle key global problems.
UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres joined leaders of the world's largest economies at the G20 leaders meetings in Rio de Janeiro this week. The theme, building a just world and a sustainable planet. Many of the priorities align with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals.
The two-day G20 Leaders Summit in Rio de Janeiro is over. Chinese President Xi Jinping said he was ready to be a partner in the effort to build what he called a just world of common development, reminding the summit leaders of China's success in lifting 800 million people out of poverty and achieving the UN's 2030 poverty reduction target ahead of schedule.
The presence of the Chinese president in Brazil at the G20 is very important. China has very significant trade relations with Brazil, so it is important to participate in exchanges like the G20 on issues such as combating hunger, tackling climate change, fair energy transition, a new global governance, and bilateral relations which deal with matters of economic interest for both China and Brazil.
President Xi said it's important for the world to support developing countries when it comes to sustainable production and international economic cooperation. In the summit's final declaration, participants called for reform of the UN Security Council and to strengthen the role of multilateral financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank to ensure greater representation for all countries. There was consensus in the summit's final declaration. It called for a tax on the world's wealthiest citizens to fund two urgent programs: the transition to net zero emissions by mid-century and President Lula's initiative, the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, which was endorsed by 81 countries, including all G20 nations, the EU and the African Union. Brazil's government says its year-long run as head of the G20 was a success, especially because of the first-time inclusion of voices of activists, NGOs, women and indigenous people in the parallel social summit.
The G20 Social Summit permeated the discussions among all the heads of state, and in my opinion, the outcome couldn't have been more positive, bringing together finance, politics, and civil society.
A final group photo op before some bilateral meetings and flights home. Spanning 22 pages, the final declaration also addressed global conflicts, calling for an end to the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, while expressing a deep concern regarding the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Lucrecia Franco, CGTN, Rio de Janeiro.
At UN headquarters, the focus remains on the conflicts in the Middle East.
The result of the voting is as follows: 14 votes in favour, 1 vote against, 0 abstentions. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council.
Wednesday, the U.S. vetoed a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, the vote triggering sharp criticism from other members of the Council.
The U.S. claims to be conducting parallel diplomatic efforts and has repeatedly promised that progress would be made soon in the negotiations. It is incomprehensible then why, to date, the so-called diplomatic negotiations have seen no progress. Why is Israel allowed to continue its military operations while consistently putting forth new conditions for negotiations? In the future, when looking back, people will find it inevitable to feel indignant.
From the Security Council to the briefing room and beyond, Shudeja is monitoring the latest developments inside the UN. Deja.
Yes, Elaine. This week, a lot happened in this building. Member states talked about Ukraine, Haiti, and Libya. But today, I'm going to talk about only 3 things. Well, first, the looting incident in Gaza. Last Saturday, a convoy of 109 trucks transporting food supplies for the WFP and UNRWA from Karim Shalom crossing was looted inside Gaza. According to reports, about 98 trucks have been looted or stolen. The convoy, initially scheduled for Sunday, was instructed by the Israeli Defense Forces to depart at short notice via an alternative unfamiliar route. Then I asked the spokesperson who those looters were.
So far, you don't know who looted those.
As again, you know, when people, armed people, try to take control of a vehicle and goods, we're not asking questions, and they're not wearing insignias.
But Monday, during the Security Council meeting, this is what Israeli Ambassador Danoon said.
We coordinated the entry of more than 108 trucks which crossed Kerem Shalom crossing into Gaza. 97 of those trucks were violently looted by Hamas, with the drivers held at gunpoint.
Now, here's the thing. IDF's objective inside Gaza is to eliminate Hamas. Almost 100 trucks were looted on the designated road by Israeli authority. It's hard to persuade people that IDF has the capacity to attack even humanitarian workers, but not that many Hamas. So here I asked Ambassador Danoon about the evidence.
You said on Monday in the Security Council that those looters, they are Hamas. Do you have evidence, and have you shared the information with the UN, because they said they are the violent gangs?
And yes, we have evidence of the Hamas involvement in the hijacking, and also we know what they're doing with the trucks, where they store them after they sell it, and they use the funds for the terror machine. So we are aware of that. We don't operate in the entire Gaza Strip today. We have control over the checkpoints, we have control over other parts, and unfortunately, we still see the activities of Hamas when it comes to take advantage of humanitarian aid.
Lastly, has the UN reached out for information?
Ambassador Danoon today talking to me saying that Israel has concrete evidence that those looters were Hamas. Will UN ask Israel for those evidences, or do you think it's irrelevant?
I can tell you that our colleagues are in close touch with the Israel authorities.
Now, the second thing, obviously concerning Gaza, is the ill-fated ceasefire draft resolution by non-permanent members of the Security Council, or E10. I'm not going to cover the meeting itself, but I did ask U.S. Deputy Ambassador Wood what language is sufficient enough for the United States.
From our standpoint, very clearly, there is not a sufficient linkage to this, and there must be. 7 Americans are being held hostage in the region. It is important that we not forget that. And so we have, as I said, approached this with an open mind. We engaged in good faith, and unfortunately, again, as I said, if the resolution that we saw is put into blue to be voted, it will not garner consensus.
What language should be sufficient?
I'm not going to negotiate it. The resolution has been discussed.
And here is the permanent representative of China, Ambassador Fu Cong, when talking about the veto.
Veto is a responsibility, not a privilege, and not something that they can use so irresponsibly to protect their so-called allies. Thank you.
And what is the response from Secretary-General of this result?
I think it's another example of the regrettable lack of consensus that we've seen in the Security Council between member states, and the lack of, frankly, the lack of implementation of previous resolutions on Gaza. For his part, the Secretary-General will continue to support all efforts to see an end to the conflict in Gaza, to achieve the unconditional release of all hostages, and to implement the two-state solution.
After voting, 18 members made a statement expressing their deeply disappointment that the text was not adopted. They underscored the permanent ending of the war in Gaza, humanitarian assistance, and respecting international law and international humanitarian law.
We are deeply committed to this responsibility and will continue our best efforts to try to facilitate Council unity on this critical matter. Too many lives have already been lost.
It's the fifth time that U.S. vetoed the draft resolution calling for ceasefire. What now? What are we going to have in the Security Council? What is the way out? Thank you.
We will continue our efforts. Thank you.
Do you think Israel is committing genocide in Gaza?
Well, number 3, a quick one. ICC, the International Criminal Court, just issued arrest warrants for Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Minister of Defense Gallant. And what's the position from the UN?
I mean, obviously, we're aware of the issuance by the ICC of the warrants against 2 Israeli officials and Hamas official. I would just tell you, as we've said before, the Secretary-General respects the work and the independence of the International Criminal Court, and I will leave it at that for now.
It's worth noting that 124 countries are states parties to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Israel, as well as Russia, the US, are not states parties. Well, that's all from me. Elaine.
Shudija, thanks. Delegates at COP29 in Azerbaijan are trying to reach key agreements to fund measures that could make a big difference in the fight against climate change.
International cooperation centered on the Paris Agreement is indispensable to climate action. Amidst geopolitical divisions and uncertainties, the world needs countries to come together here in Baku. And so I appeal directly to ministers and negotiators. Soften hard lines, navigate the path through your differences, and keep your eyes on the bigger picture.
Armed gangs have further intensified their coordinated and well-orchestrated attacks. Having encircled the capital and all access roads, armed gangs have made territorial advances in strategic areas and, according to some estimates, now control 85% of the capital.
Violence is surging in Haiti, with armed gangs gaining territory in the capital. More than 5,000 people have been killed in the first 9 months of the year. Food insecurity is at an all-time high, impacting about half the population. The Security Council is considering a request from Haiti's interim government to convert the current Kenyan-led security mission to a UN peacekeeping operation.
Coming up.
There are over 130 million people that are forcibly displaced around the world right now.
UN Insider.
Around the globe, more than 122 million people have been forced from their homes because of conflict, human rights abuses, violence, and extreme weather. Nearly 40 million of those forcibly displaced are refugees. UNHCR is the United Nations Agency for Refugees, and I sat down with David Torzilli, UNHCR's representative to Brazil.
David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me here.
We know that Brazil, in its presidency of the G20, launched the first ever G20 social summit to focus on issues of poverty, hunger. Tell us a little bit more about how UNHCR fit into that picture, what you got out of it, and what we can expect.
Yes, UNHCR was here actually facilitating the presence of a number of refugees, migrants forcibly displaced that attended the social summit. The summit was really the first and was really a great opportunity to hear civil society at large, all the organized group and movements in Brazil, but also of a country of the G20, and present their voices. So refugees, migrants participated throughout this process, and we had a great result. The priority of the Brazilian presidency were three: climate change, fight against poverty and hunger, and the reform of the multilateral system. And these three priorities are really very much linked to the global challenge of forced displacement. As you know, there are over 130 million people that are forcibly displaced around the world right now. To this, you add the millions of people that are displaced because of the impact of climate change and disaster. Here in Brazil, we saw this year what that impact is in Rio Grande do Sul. There were the flooding, devastating flooding in the south that have not only displaced thousands and thousands of Brazilians, they have affected over 2 million people in Rio Grande do Sul, but they also impacted the life of over 40,000 refugees and migrants that were living in the States.
Refugee support is needed in many different ways. So how can the G20 as a whole create a framework for addressing the needs of refugees and asylum seekers, not just in Brazil, but in other countries around the world?
What is very much needed is leadership to solve the defined challenges of our era, solve prolonged conflicts, address the impact of climate change. So I believe that the first opportunity that country of the G20 have is really to come together and try to address the crisis around the world. I believe also that having the voices of refugees in this declaration put their priority at the forefront in a way, so that countries that are receiving a large number of refugees try to implement policies that are inclusive, that help refugees to integrate, introduce in the new society, that facilitates also what refugees can bring to their new home. Brazil is developing the first national policy on this matter. So this is a great example that Brazil can bring to the G20.
How challenging is the financing issue when it comes to getting the support to deal with migrants and refugees?
Unfortunately, this increasing conflict, increasing situation of humanitarian emergency has created needs that the international community is not meeting. Financing is growing over the past few years, but the needs of people that are displaced have grown even more. The new paradigm is really to have investment going into areas that are affected by the arrival of refugees, and create the opportunity to make this to turn this influx into something positive.
You saw a big surge not too long ago in an area that you're very familiar with in the north, Pacaraimo, after Venezuela's election. I know that area has been overwhelmed already
and then this more recent surge. How is the situation there?
Yeah, we continue to see an influx of 300-400 people per day from Venezuela. We expect this influx to continue in the future. We are working very closely with the authority and other UN agency and civil society partner to prepare in case of an increase in the influx. But for now, we expect that this sustained number that will continue in the foreseeable future. The operation Welcome is working well. We are discussing with the government how to adapt the operation to the long term so that it meets the needs of the people that will eventually arrive in the future, but also it becomes more efficient and effective also for the government.
Dimitri Razili, always great to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Great to see you, and thanks a lot. Thank you for having me.
UN Insider.
Whether it's about your education, the home you live in, or the items you buy, your money has a story to tell. Because every business story is a human story. Global Business.
There are more than 476 million indigenous people around the world. About 1.7 million of them call Brazil home. Last year, the country established its Ministry of Indigenous Peoples, and I sat down with the woman who leads that effort, Sonia Guajajara. Minister Guajajara, thank you so much for joining us. You have spent your entire life fighting for indigenous rights. You've even run for vice president of Brazil, and now you're making history as the very first Minister of Indigenous Affairs. Why did Brazil feel it was so important to create this position?
Então, é a primeira vez que o Brasil tem um Ministério dos Povos Indígenas e eu me sinto muito orgulhosa de ter sido convidada pelo presidente para assumir esse ministério inédito, pela valorização da identidade dos povos indígenas e trazer o protagonismo dos povos indígenas para o centro do debate político.
As we speak, much of Brazil is burning. There has been severe drought and many fires across much of the country. How has climate change impacted indigenous lands?
Eu diria que o mundo está queimando, né? Não só o Brasil, mas vários outros países nesse momento já sofrem queimadas, incêndios florestais, né? Como consequência já das mudanças climáticas. Então, nós precisamos, sim, que os governos do mundo inteiro assumam, né, compromissos globais para combater essas consequências das mudanças climáticas, porque já não é um problema do futuro, né? É um problema que nós estamos vivendo no presente. Hoje, nós estamos numa situação muito grave, 60% do território nacional brasileiro, né, já sofreu incêndios, há um esforço muito grande do governo federal para conseguir combater esses incêndios, porque nós estamos no momento de evitar emissões, e as queimadas também são grandes emissores de gases de efeito estufa. Então, nós fazemos um chamado também para o mundo, para que cada um assuma a sua responsabilidade de reduzir suas emissões. Então, o impacto das mudanças climáticas afeta diretamente a vida dos povos indígenas. Nós estamos vivendo com uma alternância entre secas, inundações e queimadas. E todos esses eventos extremos acabam prejudicando na segurança alimentar, na navegação, deslocamento dos indígenas, né? E no próprio acesso à água potável para beber. Então, os impactos eles acabam atingindo diretamente no modo de vida de todos os povos indígenas que são afetados.
What would you say have been some of the biggest threats to indigenous culture? Could it be technology, globalization, migration of young people?
Olha, nós temos grande exemplo negativo, né, das consequências da mineração, que aliás, da mineração e do garimpo. Nós temos o caso de Mariana, em Minas Gerais, onde houve o rompimento da barragem e ainda hoje as pessoas sofrem consequências desse rompimento. A água segue contaminada, os peixes conseguem, né, contaminados, as pessoas não podem comer nem beber água desse rio. Então, nós já temos essas consequências concretas do que causa a mineração, do que causa o garimpo, do que causa o desmatamento, né, com a exploração ilegal de madeira também em outros territórios. E nós estamos num esforço agora para retirar todos esses invasores dos territórios indígenas, seja exploração ilegal de madeira, seja do garimpo ilegal, seja da grilagem das terras indígenas.
Minister Guajajara, thank you for joining us. Obrigada.
Okay, obrigada.
I'm Elaine Reyes in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Thanks for being a UN Insider. I'm Elaine Reyes at the United Nations headquarters in New York, and this is a special edition of UN Insider.
UN Insider serves as an important window for the global audience to better understand multilateral diplomacy.
It's very important for the media to cover the United Nations, to seek to understand and tell the story in ways that the average person in the street can understand.
I think it's very important that the media should contribute to conveying important messages about the reality of today's challenges.
UN Insider has come to the UN, and we at the UN are so grateful to have it here. It is the only dedicated TV program to what is happening in the UN, and it is reaching so many people with, as it says in its title, inside the UN stories.
Media plays an important role in providing objective information across the world.
We think that media has a strong power of uplifting, what we are trying to convey as messages as developing countries.
We need the mobilization of all peoples, of whole government and whole of society, and media can help us to be informed so that we also can make our part.
I think the media is fundamental to enable citizens across the world, first of all, to understand what is the rationale of having the United Nations. It's not that there is one place on planet Earth that will tell the rest of the world what to do. It is a much more complex story.